The marriage was meant to be the salvation of her people, a fragile human treaty sealed in vampire blood and gilded promises. Instead, it became her execution. Not of the body, which was a mercy she would have begged for in that moment, but of the soul. Of the name she carried, the hope she had nurtured, the woman she had believed herself to be. The air in the grand cathedral of Ethelgard was thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and cold stone, a perfume for a tomb. Elara stood at the altar, a ghost in white silk, the silver circlet of her station biting into her brow. For an hour, she had stood there. An hour that had stretched into a lifetime, each tick of the great obsidian clock a hammer blow against the silent, watching faces of the vampire court. They were statues of alabaster and jet, their ancient eyes holding a pity so profound it was its own form of cruelty. He was not coming. The thought, at first a whisper of doubt, had grown into a roar that deafened her to the shuffling feet and murmured condolences of her own human retinue. Valerus, the vampire king, whose hand she had accepted, whose cool, possessive gaze had promised her a future, had abandoned her. Here, in the heart of his power, before the eyes of his enemies and allies, he had made her a monument to his own caprice. Then, the cathedral doors groaned open. Not with the triumphant entry of a groom, but with the measured, funereal tread of his chamberlain. Lord Valerus, the man announced, his voice devoid of all emotion, had been called away on a matter of state. A new alliance had been forged. A more advantageous union. He spoke of treaties and territories, of the Empress of the Obsidian Coast and her offer of fleets and legions, words that were meant to sound like statecraft but landed like stones thrown at a drowning woman. The chamberlain's voice faded. All Elara could hear was the blood pounding in her ears, a frantic human drum in a hall of silent hearts. The collective gaze of the court pressed down, a physical weight that threatened to buckle her knees. They were not looking at a princess. They were looking at a fool. A discarded trinket. Her value, so carefully calculated in dowry negotiations and land rights, had evaporated in a single, public moment. Her people, whose lives this union was meant to secure, were now more vulnerable than ever. The shame was a fire, licking at the edges of her composure, threatening to burn the carefully constructed mask of royalty to ash. She raised her eyes from the intricate mosaic at her feet, a pattern of entwined serpents devouring their own tails. Her gaze swept over the silent, waiting lords and ladies of the night court, their faces a gallery of polite, predatory curiosity. They were waiting for her to weep, to faint, to shatter, to give them the dramatic catharsis their cold hearts craved. And then she saw him. In a shadowed alcove, set apart from the vampire nobles, stood the delegation from the wild lands of the north. The Lycans. Their presence was a political necessity, a forced attendance to witness the consolidation of their greatest enemy's power. And at their head stood Kaelan, the wolf lord, his face a mask of granite stillness that, unlike the vampires, seemed to hold not contempt, but a deep, quiet gravity. He was Valerus's oldest and most bitter rival, a creature of savage strength and rumored barbarism, the antithesis of the cold, sophisticated world she was meant to join. His eyes, the color of winter twilight, were fixed on her, and in them, she saw not pity, but a flicker of something else. Recognition. A shared understanding of what it was to be on the outside, to be judged and found wanting by this gilded cage of a court. In that moment, something inside her broke. But it did not fall apart. It fractured, and the pieces reformed into something new, something hard and sharp. The fire of her shame did not die, it coalesced into a single, burning point of defiant rage. Valerus had used her as a pawn in his great game. He had sacrificed her for power. Very well. Two could play at games of power. Two could forge alliances. Her heart, which had felt like a stone in her chest, began to beat again, a slow, deliberate rhythm. A new plan bloomed in the ruins of the old, a desperate, beautiful, terrible idea. She would not be a victim in this story. She would not be a footnote in the history of Valerus's reign. If he wanted to make her a spectacle, then she would give them a spectacle they would never forget. Slowly, deliberately, she turned from the empty altar. The heavy silk of her gown whispered against the marble as she began to walk, not back down the aisle in retreat, but across the dais. The movement was so unexpected it sent a ripple of shock through the assembly. Murmurs broke the suffocating silence. She ignored them. She ignored her weeping handmaidens, the stunned face of the chamberlain, the predatory gleam in the eyes of the court. She had only one destination. Her steps were even, her back straight, the silver circlet a crown of ice and fire on her head. She walked towards the shadows. Towards the enemy. Towards the one man in this cathedral whose hatred for Valerus might just rival her own. She stopped before the lichened delegation. The wolves, in their human forms, clad in dark leather and furs that seemed to absorb the cathedral's light, tensed, their hands moving subtly towards the hilts of hidden weapons. They smelled of pine and cold air and wild earth, a scent of freedom that was a stark contrast to the cloying jasmine of the court. Ilara's gaze met Kaelin's. Up close, his stillness was even more profound, a deep well of ancient calm. His face was weathered, carved by winds she could not imagine, and a scar cut a pale line through one dark eyebrow. He did not move, did not speak. He simply watched her, his twilight eyes missing nothing. She took a breath, the cold air steadying her. Her voice, when it came, did not tremble. It was clear and sharp as splintered glass, ringing through the cavernous space, a sound that cut through every whisper and silenced the entire cathedral. "Lord Kaelin," she said, her address a formal challenge. He inclined his head, a bare, fractional movement. "Princess Ilara." The court held its breath. This was an unprecedented breach of protocol, a direct address between sworn enemies in the heart of their rival's domain. "I find myself," Ilara continued, the ghost of a smile touching her lips, "a bitter, dangerous thing, in need of a husband." A collective gasp swept the room. It was a sound like the tide pulling away from the shore, leaving behind a stunned, terrible silence. Kaelin's expression did not change, but she saw something shift deep in his eyes, a flicker of cold, calculating intelligence. He understood. He understood the game she was playing, the sheer, audacious spite of the move. "My alliance with the Vampire King is dissolved," she said, letting the understatement hang in the air, heavy with insult. "But my kingdom still needs an ally. My people still need protection." She let her gaze sweep over the vampires, a silent accusation. "Protection that, it seems, is no longer offered here." She brought her eyes back to his. This was the moment. The precipice. The leap into an abyss from which there would be no return. "You are the enemy of my enemy," she said, her voice dropping, becoming more intimate, a shared secret in a room full of witnesses. "Your people are threatened by this new alliance as much as mine. Our interests, it would seem, are aligned." She held his gaze, pouring every ounce of her shattered pride, her burning rage, and her desperate hope into that single look. "Marry me, Lord Kaelin. Take me as your wife, and let us give King Valerus the wedding gift he so richly deserves, a war on two fronts." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a living thing, a pressure that could crack stone. The vampire lords looked as if they had been turned to marble, their immortal composure finally, irrevocably broken. Ilara's own attendants were pale with terror. She had not just insulted a king, she had declared war in his own temple. Kaelin studied her, his gaze intense, searching. He was reading her, she knew, looking past the silken gown and the silver circlet, past the public humiliation, to the core of the woman making this impossible offer. He was weighing the cost, the risk, the sheer political insanity of it. His people and hers had no history, no love between them. This would be an alliance born of nothing but spite and desperation. It was a gamble that could destroy them both. He took a step forward, breaking the frozen tableau. He was taller than she had realized, a formidable presence of quiet power. The scent of the wild grew stronger, a clean, sharp fragrance that cut through the stale incense. He stopped just before her, so close she could see the flecks of grey in his dark hair, the fine lines around his eyes. He lifted a hand, and for a terrifying second, she thought he would strike her, or push her away. Instead, his calloused fingers brushed a stray tear from her cheek, a tear she hadn't even realized had fallen. The touch was unexpectedly gentle, a spark of warmth against her cold skin. "He is a fool," Kaelin said, his voice a low rumble, meant for her alone, yet it carried in the unnatural stillness. It was the first judgment he had passed, the first alignment he had declared. Then he raised his voice, his words echoing off the vaulted ceilings, a proclamation that would shatter the balance of power for a generation. "I accept." Chaos erupted. The word was a spark in a powder keg. Shouts echoed through the cathedral. Vampire guards drew their swords, their polished armor glinting in the candlelight. The lichens closed ranks around their lord, their bodies shifting into a predatory crouch, the air crackling with the imminent threat of transformation. Kaelin paid them no mind. His eyes remained on Elara. He held out his arm, a formal, steady offer. A promise. "My lady," he said, his voice a calm anchor in the rising storm. "It seems we have a journey to make." Elara looked from his offered arm to the face of the chamberlain, whose expression was a mask of pure fury and disbelief. She looked at the panicked faces of her human retinue, caught between a vengeful king and a new, uncertain future. And she looked at the empty altar, where her life was supposed to have begun, and where it had instead been broken. She placed her hand on Kaelin's arm. The leather of his bracer was warm and solid beneath her trembling fingers. It felt more real than any promise Valerus had ever made. "Indeed, my lord," she replied, her voice firm, the last of her fear burned away by the cold fire of her resolve. "Let us not keep our new life waiting." Together, they turned their backs on the altar, on the sputtering rage of the night court, and walked towards the great doors. The lichens formed a wedge around them, a moving wall of leather and muscle, their silent menace more potent than any shouted threat. The vampires parted before them, their shock and fury held in check by the sheer audacity of what had just transpired. They were letting them go, for now. The repercussions would come later, swift and terrible, but for this one moment, Elara was not the jilted bride. She was the woman who had stolen a king's enemy from under his nose and lit the match that would set his world on fire. The heavy doors of the cathedral swung open, and the pale light of a dying afternoon flooded in. It was not the bright, hopeful dawn of a wedding day, but it was light all the same. As she stepped out of the tomb-like chill and into the open air, Elara did not look back. She had a new home to find, a new alliance to forge, and a new husband at her side, a stranger bound to her by a single, beautiful act of spite. The future was a terrifying unknown, a path leading into the heart of the wild north, but for the first time in a very long time, it was a path of her own choosing. The journey from Ethelgard was a flight. There was no other word for it. They moved with the swift, silent purpose of a pack on the hunt, or the hunted. Kaelin's lichens melted into the city's shadows, their movements economical and sure, a stark contrast to the rigid formality of the vampire sentries they slipped past. Elara, her impractical silk gown now seeming like a cruel joke, was half-carried, half-hustled through winding alleyways and forgotten postern gates, her human attendants trailing behind like bewildered ghosts. The cold air of the city night was a shock after the cathedral's stagnant warmth. It smelled of damp stone, coal smoke, and the metallic tang of vampire ambition. Elara's mind struggled to keep pace with her body. The cathedral felt a lifetime away, a fever dream of jasmine and humiliation. Now, there was only the rough texture of Kaelin's leather-clad arm beneath her hand, the rhythmic tread of his boots on the cobblestones, and the feeling of being pulled inexorably forward into a future she had just recklessly invented. They did not speak. There was no time, no space for words. The air was too fraught with the unspoken, the political earthquake they had triggered, the personal abyss they had both just leapt into. What could they possibly say? "Thank you for agreeing to ruin your life to spite my former fiancé. I hope you don't regret binding your people to a desperate, powerless human princess." Silence was safer. Silence was a shield. At the city's edge, where the manicured vampire estates gave way to tangled, untamed woods, horses were waiting. Not the placid, elegant mares of the royal stables, but shaggy, powerful beasts with wild eyes and breath that plumed like smoke in the chill. Kaelin lifted her onto a saddle as if she weighed nothing, his hands firm and impersonal at her waist. The brief contact sent another jolt through her, a startling reminder of the physical reality of her choice. This man, this stranger, was now her husband, her ally, her protector. The ride north was grueling. They rode for days, stopping only for brief, furtive rests in hidden clearings. The opulent, sterile beauty of the vampire lands slowly gave way to something older, wilder. The trees grew taller, their branches clawing at the sky. The air grew colder, sharper, filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Elara, accustomed to perfumed chambers and velvet cushions, found her body aching in ways she'd never known. Her wedding gown was torn and stained, a sad relic of a life that no longer existed. One of Kaelin's guards, a stern-faced woman named Anya with eyes as grey as her wolf's pelt, had given her a spare set of leather breeches and a fur-lined cloak. The practical, unadorned garments felt more honest, more real, than the silk had ever been. During their brief stops, Ilara watched Kalen. He was a creature of profound stillness, yet he seemed to see everything. He moved with a quiet confidence that was not arrogance but a deep, instinctual connection to his surroundings. He spoke little, his commands to his pack given in low tones or with simple hand gestures. They understood him perfectly. She saw the way they looked at him with a fierce, unwavering loyalty that Valerus, for all his power and grandeur, had never commanded. Valerus ruled through fear and intricate webs of obligation. Kalen, it seemed, led through respect. On the third night, they made camp in the lee of a granite cliff face. A small, smokeless fire pushed back the encroaching dark. Ilara sat huddled in her cloak, nursing a cup of bitter, bracing tea, watching the flames. The exhaustion was a heavy cloak, but sleep felt impossible. Her mind was a maelstrom of fear and uncertainty. Kalen came to sit beside her. He didn't sit too close, maintaining a respectful distance, yet his presence was a solid, reassuring weight in the vast, dark wilderness. For a long time, they sat in silence, listening to the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the wind in the pines. "You have been quiet," he said finally, his voice a low rumble that seemed to blend with the sounds of the night. Ilara stared into the fire. "I have had little to say." "Regret?" The question was soft, without judgment. She considered it. Did she regret it? The humiliation? The fear? The utter demolition of her life's purpose? "I regret being made a fool of," she said, her voice tight. "I regret that my people's safety was a lie. I do not regret my choice at the altar." She looked at him then, meeting his steady gaze across the flickering firelight. "Do you?" He held her gaze for a long moment, his twilight eyes seeming to absorb the fire's glow. "The repercussions will be severe," he said, not answering her question directly. "Valerus will not see this as a simple insult. He will see it as a strategic threat. His new alliance with the Obsidian Empress gives him access to the sea. He will believe we mean to encircle him." "Do we?" she asked, the strategist in her, the princess trained in statecraft, awakening from its shock-induced slumber. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. It transformed his harsh face, hinting at a warmth hidden deep beneath the granite surface. "We do now," he shifted, turning to face her more fully. "My people have been pushed back by his encroachments for a generation. We have lost hunting grounds, sacred sites. We fight a defensive war, a war of attrition. Your proposal, it was an act of emotion, princess. But it was also the most strategically sound move you could have made. It turns our defense into a potential offense. It gives us a new front, a new ally, a new kind of legitimacy." Ilara felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt since before the wedding: purpose. "My people know the southern passes. They have maps Valerus has never seen. Our farmers and woodsmen know the land in a way his soldiers do not." "I know," Kalen said quietly. "That is one of the reasons I accepted." His frankness was both startling and refreshing. There were no pretty lies between them, no courtly deceptions. Theirs was a union of mutual interest, and he was not afraid to name it. "And the other reasons?" she found herself asking, her voice barely a whisper. He looked away from her, his gaze on the dancing flames. "I saw the look on your face when the Chamberlain spoke," he said, his voice low. "I have seen that look on the faces of my own people when Valerus's decrees steal their land or their children are conscripted for his endless border wars. He builds his throne on the backs of others. And I saw that you were not broken. You were forged." He looked back at her, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "Spite can be a powerful weapon, Princess Ilara. But courage is a sharper one. You showed both. I decided I would rather have such a weapon at my side than aimed at my back." For the first time since she had put on her wedding gown, Ilara felt a genuine, unforced warmth spread through her chest. He had not seen a jilted bride, a hysterical woman, or a political pawn. He had seen a queen. He had seen her strength, even when she herself had felt it was gone. "My name is just Ilara," she said softly. He gave a small, formal nod. "Kalen." It was not a declaration of love, not a promise of a happy future. It was something smaller, and perhaps more vital. It was an introduction. An acknowledgement. The first, fragile thread of a real alliance, spun not just from politics and spite, but from a flicker of mutual respect in the deep, cold dark of the northern woods. As she finally drifted into an exhausted sleep by the dying fire, lulled by the quiet presence of the Wolf Lord and his pack, Ilara felt a strange and unfamiliar sensation. It was not happiness, not yet. But it was something very much like hope. Their arrival at Skolheim, the Lycan stronghold, was nothing like the grand, ceremonial entries she was used to. There were no trumpets, no cheering crowds. They slipped through a series of fortified gates built into the mountainside itself, the fortress a living part of the granite peaks that sheltered it. It was a place of stone and timber, of function over form, built for endurance and defense, not for show. Smoke plumed from dozens of chimneys, carrying the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat. The air was alive with sounds, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the shouts of children playing, the low murmur of a community at work. It was utterly alien. And it was alive in a way Ethelgard, with its cold, silent perfection, had never been. But if the stronghold was alive, it was also wary. As Ilara rode behind Kaelin into the central courtyard, a hush fell. Faces turned towards them from windows and walkways. The initial joy at their lord's return was instantly tempered by the sight of her. A human. A princess from the soft southern lands, wearing the cloak of their pack but looking utterly out of place. Their eyes were not hostile, not yet, but they were filled with a deep, profound suspicion. She was the unknown, the outsider, a symbol of the very political games that had cost them so much. Kaelin dismounted and turned to help her down. His hands were gentle, but his face was grim. He understood what she was facing. "They are not accustomed to outsiders," he said in a low voice. "Trust is earned here, not given." "I am aware," Ilara replied, forcing herself to meet the curious, distrustful gazes. She would not hide. She would not cower. She was their queen now, whether they wished it or not. A queen should not expect to be loved for her title, but for her actions. A flicker of approval crossed his face. He led her towards the great hall, a massive longhouse with a soaring, timber-framed roof. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the scent of burning logs and stew. A long table dominated the room, and at its head sat an old woman with hair as white as snow and eyes as sharp as a hawk's. She was bent over a piece of intricate carving, but she looked up as they entered, her gaze immediately locking on Ilara. "So," the old woman said, her voice raspy with age but carrying an undeniable authority. "The southern bird has come to roost in our wolf's den." "Gel," Kaelin said, his tone respectful. "This is Ilara. My wife." The word still sounded strange, a borrowed garment that didn't quite fit. The old woman, Gel, studied Ilara for a long, uncomfortable moment. Her eyes seemed to strip away the fine clothes, the royal bearing, and see right into the desperate, frightened heart of her. "She smells of vampire perfume and fear," Gel observed bluntly. "An ill-omened combination." Ilara felt a flush of anger. She lifted her chin. "I also smell of dust from a 3-day ride and the smoke of your fires, Elder. I can do little about the perfume of a court I have fled, and any sane person would feel fear when their life has been upended. But I am here. And I am his wife. That is a reality you will have to accept." The old woman's stern expression cracked. A dry, rustling laugh escaped her. "She has teeth, this one. Good. A wolf needs a mate with teeth." She gestured to the bench beside her. "Sit. Eat. We will see what kind of queen you make." It was not a welcome, but it was not a dismissal either. It was a challenge. Ilara accepted it, taking her seat and eating the simple, hearty stew she was offered, all under the watchful eyes of the pack's elders. Later, Kaelin led her to the chambers that were to be hers. They were in the Lord's tower, adjacent to his own, but distinctly separate. A thick stone wall and a heavy wooden door stood between them. The room was sparsely furnished but comfortable, with a large hearth, a bed piled with furs, and a window that looked out over the snow-dusted peaks. It was a safe, quiet space. A cage, of a sort. "You will be safe here," Kaelin said, standing in the doorway, not crossing the threshold. He seemed awkward, uncertain, a stark contrast to the decisive leader she had seen on the journey. Here, in the quiet of a domestic space, the chasm between their two worlds seemed vast and impassable. The terms of our alliance, Ilara began, turning to face him, deciding it was better to build this new reality on a foundation of truth. We should be clear. He nodded, his expression serious. This is a political marriage. I will honor you as my wife in public. I will give you my name and my protection. Your people will have our support. In return, I expect your counsel, your knowledge of Valeruz's court, and your loyalty to this pack. He paused, his gaze unwavering. I will ask for nothing more from you. You will have your own life, your own chambers. I will not, he searched for the words. I will not impose myself upon you. A wave of relief so profound it almost made her dizzy washed over Ilara. The fear, lurking in the back of her mind, that she had exchanged one form of servitude for another, finally receded. He was offering her autonomy, respect, a freedom she had never truly had, not even as a princess. And you, she asked, her voice softer than she intended. What do you gain from this, Kaelin? Besides a second front in your war. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the mountains visible through her window. I gain a chance, he said quietly. A chance for my people to do more than just survive. For too long, we have been defined by what we are not vampires, not fully human. We have been a people of the margins. This alliance, it puts us at the center of the board. It is a risk. But the greatest risk is to do nothing. He looked back at her, and she saw the immense weight of his leadership in his eyes, the burden of 1,000 souls resting on his shoulders. That is what I gain. He was a king, she realized, in a way Valeruz, with all his crowns and ceremony, could never be. His power came not from a throne, but from his people. His crown was his responsibility to them. Thank you, she said, the words simple but heartfelt. For your honesty. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Rest, Ilara. Tomorrow, the work begins. He turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. Ilara stood alone in her new room, in her new home, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire. The distance between her room and his felt both like a comfort and a vast, empty expanse. They were allies, partners in a great and dangerous game. They were husband and wife. And they were complete and utter strangers. She wrapped her arms around herself, the fur-lined cloak a poor substitute for a warmth she was only just beginning to realize she craved. The work, he had said, was beginning. And she understood, with a sudden, aching clarity, that he was not just talking about the war. The days that followed settled into a quiet, watchful rhythm. Ilara became a student of Skolheim, her life a tapestry woven from small observations and tentative interactions. She learned the names of the pack elders, the routines of the guards, the best paths to the library, a dusty, treasured chamber filled with aging maps and human histories collected over centuries. She learned that Lycan society was not the savage, chaotic thing Valeruz's propaganda had painted it to be. It was deeply communal, built on intricate bonds of loyalty and a fierce, protective love for their own. But she was not one of their own. She felt their eyes on her as she walked through the fortress, a constant, silent assessment. They were polite, deferential to her title as Kaelin's wife, but there was a wall of reserve she could not seem to breach. To them, she was a southerner, a creature of politics and soft living, a symbol of the outside world that had only ever brought them trouble. She was the queen of a kingdom of spite, and they were waiting to see if that was all she was. Kaelin was a constant, distant presence. He treated her with impeccable courtesy. They took their meals together at the head of the great hall, a united front for his people. They met daily in the war council, where her insights into Valeruz's mind and the weaknesses of the vampire aristocracy proved invaluable. She pointed out supply lines that ran through human lands loyal to her family, identified vampire generals known for their arrogance and predictability, and suggested diplomatic overtures to other human territories wary of Valeruz's growing power. In these meetings, they were a formidable team. She saw a new respect dawning in the eyes of his war council, and in Kaelin's own gaze. He listened to her, truly listened, valuing her mind in a way no one, not even her own father, ever had. But once the maps were rolled up and the strategies debated, a chasm would open between them once more. They would walk back to their towers in a charged silence, parting at her door with a formal nod. The stone wall between their chambers was a perfect metaphor for the state of their marriage, adjacent, allied, but utterly separate. One evening, seeking refuge from the boisterous energy of the Great Hall, Elara found her way to the fortress's highest battlements. The wind was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of snow from the higher peaks. The sky was a vast, crystalline canopy of stars, more brilliant than she had ever seen in the smog-shrouded skies of the south. The world felt immense, and she felt profoundly small and alone within it. "You will catch a chill." Kaelin's voice came from the shadows behind her. She hadn't heard him approach. He moved with a wolf's silence. He came to stand beside her at the parapet, not crowding her, but sharing the space. He held out a heavy fur blanket. She took it, wrapping it around her shoulders, grateful for the warmth. "I needed some air," she said, her voice thin in the vast emptiness. "It is loud in the hall." "It is the sound of a family," he said, his gaze on the valley below, where the lights of a few small homesteads twinkled. "We are not a quiet people." "No," she agreed, a small smile touching her lips. "You are not." They stood in a comfortable silence for a time, the kind that was slowly, tentatively, beginning to grow between them. It was no longer the tense, awkward silence of their journey, but something calmer, more accepting. "Gael likes you," he said, the observation unexpected. Elara raised an eyebrow. "She called me a southern bird with teeth." "It is the highest compliment she has paid to an outsider in 50 years, Kaelin replied, a hint of amusement in his voice. "She says you do not flinch. That you look people in the eye. She says you have the heart of a wolf, even if you are trapped in the body of a canary." Elara felt a strange warmth bloom in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fur blanket. To be seen, to be judged not on her title or her beauty or her political value, but on her character, it was a novel, and not unpleasant, sensation. "And what do you think, my lord?" she asked, her voice soft, testing the fragile peace between them. "Do you think I have the heart of a wolf?" He turned his head, his profile stark and handsome in the starlight. His twilight eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something in them beyond the leader, the strategist, the king. She saw the man. There was a loneliness there, a deep, abiding solitude that mirrored her own. "I think," he said, his voice a low, intimate rumble, that Valerus did not know what he was throwing away. The words were simple, but they landed with the force of a physical blow. It was not a compliment on her beauty or her grace. It was an acknowledgement of her worth. Of the person she was, separate from any king or kingdom. Her breath hitched. The space between them, which had always seemed so vast, suddenly felt charged, electric, and dangerously small. She saw his hand lift, his fingers slightly outstretched, as if he meant to touch her face, to tuck a strand of windblown hair behind her ear. It was a hesitant, uncertain gesture, a question asked without words. And in that moment, Elara felt a terrifying, exhilarating impulse to lean into that touch, to close the final inches between them, to see what it would feel like to not be so utterly alone. But the moment was broken by the sound of a guard's boots on the stone steps. Kaelin's hand dropped. The mask of the impassive leader fell back into place. The distance returned. "The scouts have returned," the guard announced, bowing his head. "News from the south." Kaelin nodded, his attention already shifting back to the war, to his duties. "I must go." He looked at Elara, his eyes once again unreadable. "Good night." He was gone as silently as he had appeared, leaving her alone on the battlements with the cold wind, the silent stars, and the ghost of a touch that had never happened. She pulled the fur tighter around her shoulders, but the warmth was gone. A new kind of chill had settled over her, the ache of a connection offered and then snatched away. Their alliance was one of convenience, she reminded herself. A partnership. Nothing more. But as she stood there, watching the door through which he had disappeared, she had to admit, with a terrifying honesty, that she was beginning to wish it was. The news from the south was grim. Valerus, enraged by the double insult of her abandonment and her immediate alliance with his enemy, had moved faster than anyone anticipated. He had not declared open war, that was not his style. Instead, he had begun a campaign of slow strangulation. Vampire patrols pushed aggressively into the borderlands her people called home, seizing harvests, blocking trade routes, and imposing crushing taxes. It was a show of force meant to punish her kingdom for her perceived betrayal, and to demonstrate to the Lycans the powerlessness of their new allies. Word came through smuggled letters from her father, his script thin and shaky with fear. He pleaded with her, begging her to reconsider, to placate Valerus, to do anything to stop the Vampire King's wrath. He did not understand. He still saw her as a pawn to be sacrificed, not a player who had made her own move. The letters left a bitter taste in her mouth. In the war room, the atmosphere was tense. Kaelin's council, a mix of grizzled warriors and sharp-eyed elders, looked at the maps with deepening frowns. Their own northern borders were being tested by probing attacks from the forces of the Obsidian Empress, Valerus's new fiancé. It was exactly as Kaelin had predicted, a war on two fronts. He is stretching us thin, a warrior named Ulrich growled, his hand clenched into a fist on the table. Forcing us to divide our strength. If we send forces south to aid Alara's people, we weaken the north. If we hold the north, her lands will be bled dry before the first snows. It is a classic vampire strategy, Alara said, her voice cutting through the frustrated murmurs. All eyes turned to her. She had their attention now, their respect earned through weeks of astute counsel. Valerus avoids direct confrontation where he might lose. He prefers to win by 1,000 cuts. He wants to make my people suffer, to make them curse my name and beg for his mercy. He wants you, she said, looking at Kaelin, to see me not as an asset, but as a liability. A drain on your resources. And he is succeeding, another elder muttered grimly. No, Kaelin said, his voice a quiet command that silenced all dissent. He had been standing before the great hearth, watching the flames, but now he turned, his gaze sweeping over his council before settling on Alara. He is succeeding only if we play his game. He walked to the table, his presence calming the rising tension. We will not be divided. And we will not let our allies wither on the vine. He looked directly at Alara, a silent promise passing between them. We need a new strategy. Something Valerus will not anticipate. For the next several hours, they debated. They spoke of feints and ambushes, of guerrilla tactics and desperate defenses. But every plan seemed to lead back to the same problem. They were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Alara listened, her mind racing. She knew Valerus. She had spent months at his court, studying him, learning the intricate dance of his politics. He was arrogant. He believed his power was absolute, his intellect unmatched. His greatest weakness was his inability to conceive of a threat from those he considered beneath him. Humans. Lycans. They were, in his mind, lesser beings, predictable in their desperation. We are focusing on the wrong front, she said suddenly, the idea taking shape in her mind, bold and terrifying. Kaelin turned his full attention to her. Explain. He expects us to react defensively. To scramble to protect the borders he is pushing. He is watching the edges of the board. But he is not watching the center. She moved to the map, her finger tracing a path not along the borders, but deep into Valerus's own territory. The Blackwood. It's a vast, ancient forest that his patrols avoid. They consider it haunted, impassable. But my people, our hunters and trappers know secret paths through it. Paths that lead here. Her finger landed on a location just a day's ride from Ethelgard itself. A small, seemingly insignificant castle. Shadowfall Keep. Ulrich scoffed. A ruin. It hasn't been garrisoned in a century. Exactly, Alara said, her eyes alight with fierce energy. It's not garrisoned, but it is not a ruin. It is where Valerus stores the national grain reserve. His winter supply. Not just for his armies, but for the human populaces under his control. He keeps it there because no one would ever think to attack it. It is his hidden larder. A slow understanding began to dawn on the faces around the table. If that reserve were to be compromised, Alara continued, he would face a crisis. Not a military one, but a political one. His human subjects would starve. They would riot. He would be forced to pull his troops back from the borders to control his own heartland. It would relieve the pressure on my people and on yours, and it would do so without a single major battle. The audacity of the plan silenced the room. It was a direct strike at the king's own power base, a move of shocking impertinence. It is too risky, Gel, the old elder, said, her voice heavy with caution. A small force, so deep in his lands. They would be cut off, surrounded. They would if they were an army, Kaelin said, his eyes fixed on the map, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. He was seeing it. He was seeing the brilliance of her plan. but a small, fast-moving raiding party, wolves moving through the woods. He looked up at Ilara, his twilight eyes blazing with an admiration that made her heart skip a beat. They would never see it coming. He turned to his council. This is our move. Ulrich, you will lead a diversionary attack on the northern border. Make it loud. Make it look desperate. Draw the Empress's attention. The rest of us, he straightened, his voice ringing with newfound purpose. We will take a walk in the Blackwood. He looked back at Ilara, and the formal distance between them seemed to vanish, replaced by the fierce, exhilarating connection of two commanders, two partners, who had just found the key to victory. You have given us a throat to cut, my lady. Now, we will see if the Vampire King bleeds. The decision was made. For the first time, Ilara felt like more than just a refugee or a symbol. She was a vital part of this pack, a strategist whose mind was as valuable as any warrior's strength. And as she met Kaelin's gaze across the worn surface of the map, she felt the last remnants of the humiliated princess she had been die away, replaced by the queen she was becoming. The raid on Shadowfall Keep required more than just a plan. It required a level of trust and coordination that their fledgling alliance had not yet truly tested. Kaelin decided to lead the party himself, a small, elite group of his fastest and stealthiest warriors. To Ilara's surprise, and against the grumbled protests of some of his guards, he insisted she come with them. You know the terrain, he'd stated, his tone leaving no room for argument when she had questioned the wisdom of bringing a queen, on such a dangerous mission. You know the people. If we encounter any of your countrymen, your presence will ensure their cooperation, not their fear. You are not a liability, Ilara. You are our key. His faith in her was a heady, terrifying thing. She had never held a weapon, never ridden into danger. But the thought of being left behind, of waiting powerlessly in Skolheim while he risked his life on a plan she had devised, was unbearable. And so, she found herself clad in dark leathers, a short sword she barely knew how to use strapped to her hip, riding beside him into the deepening shadows of the Blackwood. The forest was a different world. Ancient, silent, and deeply intimidating. The trees formed a dense canopy that blotted out the sun, plunging the world into a perpetual twilight. The lichens moved through it with an eerie grace, their senses alive to every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves. For them, it was a sanctuary. For Ilara, it was a place of ghosts and shadows. Kaelin seemed to feel her unease. He stayed close, his presence a silent reassurance. During their first night's camp, as she sat staring into the darkness beyond their small, hidden fire, he came to sit with her. You are not afraid of the dark, are you, Queen of the North? He asked, his voice a low tease. I am not afraid of the dark, she retorted, though her heart was pounding. I am unaccustomed to it being so, alive. He nodded in understanding. The forest speaks, to those who listen. It tells us where the deer are, where the streams run, where our enemies walk. He held out his hand, palm up. Give me your hand. Hesitantly, she placed her hand in his. His palm was warm and calloused, engulfing her smaller, softer one. It was the first time they had touched so deliberately, for so long. A current, warm and startling, seemed to pass between them. He closed his eyes. Be still, he murmured. Close your eyes. Don't try to see. Just, feel. She did as he asked, her breath catching in her throat. With her sight gone, her other senses sharpened. She could feel the gentle vibration of the ground beneath her, the faint stir of the air on her skin. She could hear the whisper of the wind, the distant hoot of an owl, the impossibly soft tread of one of their sentries moving through the undergrowth. And through Kaelin's hand, she felt something else, a steady, rhythmic pulse. Not his heartbeat, but something deeper, slower. The forest has a heartbeat, he whispered, his voice close to her ear. We are a part of it. And so are you. When she opened her eyes, the forest no longer seemed so menacing. It was still vast and wild, but it felt less alien. He was showing her his world, not through words, but through experience. He was inviting her in. He held her hand for a moment longer than necessary before releasing it, and the loss of his warmth left her feeling strangely bereft. 2 days later, they reached the edge of the Blackwood, looking down on Shadowfall Keep. It was just as she described, an old, forgotten fortress, its grey stone walls covered in ivy. A single plume of smoke rose from a chimney, betraying the presence of the small caretaker staff Valerus kept there. There were no patrols, no high alerts. The Vampire King's arrogance was their greatest ally. They attacked at midnight, under the sliver of a new moon. It was not a battle, it was an infiltration. The Lycans moved like ghosts, scaling the walls, disabling the handful of guards with silent, non-lethal efficiency. Ilara's role was to guide them to the granaries, her memory of the castle's layout, learned from old royal maps, proving flawless. They found the massive storehouses, filled to the rafters with sacks of grain, flour, and dried goods. Enough to feed an army for a year. The sight of it, the symbol of Valeruz's hoarded power, filled her with a cold fury. Kaelin's warriors worked quickly, not to destroy the food, but to spoil it. They ripped open sacks, pouring salted water and fast-acting mold spores they had prepared into the grain. It was a subtle, insidious form of destruction. The food would look fine for a few days, but by the time the spoilage was discovered, it would be too late. The damage would be irreversible. As the last sack was tainted, a sound made them all freeze. A child's cry. It came from the small keep at the center of the castle. Kaelin shot Ilara a questioning look. The caretakers, she whispered. A family, perhaps. I didn't know. They found them in the main hall, a middle-aged human couple and their young daughter, huddled in terror. The man held a rusty pitchfork, a pathetic defense against the shadowy figures who had invaded his home. Please, the woman begged, clutching her child. Take what you want. We have nothing of value. Before Kaelin or his warriors could speak, Ilara stepped forward into the lantern light. She pulled back the hood of her cloak. The man and woman gasped, their eyes widening in recognition. Princess Ilara, the man whispered in disbelief. I am no longer a princess, she said, her voice gentle but firm. I am queen in the north. And these are my allies. She looked at the terrified family, her heart aching for the fear they had caused. This was the human cost of their war. We mean you no harm. But the food in those storehouses belongs to a tyrant who is starving your countrymen on the borders. We have rendered it useless to him. But, the king, the woman stammered. He will blame us. He will execute us. Ilara had anticipated this. She turned to Kaelin. We cannot leave them here. Kaelin nodded, his expression grim. He understood immediately. Leaving them was a death sentence. He spoke a few quiet words in the Lycan tongue to one of his warriors, who disappeared into the shadows. Ilara knelt before the family. You cannot stay here. You must flee. Go to my people in the southern foothills. Tell them Queen Ilara sent you. They will give you shelter. She reached into a pouch at her belt and pulled out a small, heavy purse of gold. This will help you on your way. The woman wept with relief. The warrior returned, carrying a bundle of food and water. As they prepared to leave the family, to send them out into the night, Kaelin came to stand beside Ilara. He put a hand on her shoulder. The touch was firm, grounding. It was not the hesitant, questioning gesture from the battlements. It was a touch of solidarity, of partnership. You did well, he murmured, his voice for her alone. You showed them mercy. A true queen protects her people. All of her people. His praise, so simple and sincere, struck her more deeply than any courtly flattery ever had. In that moment, surrounded by the shadows of their shared victory, she felt the last wall around her heart begin to crumble. This man, who had married her out of political calculation, who had every reason to be as cold and ruthless as the king they fought, was a man of honor. A man who understood that true strength was tempered with compassion. They slipped away from Shadowfall Keep as silently as they had come, leaving behind a spoiled harvest and a family set on the road to freedom. As they rode back towards the safety of the Blackwood, Ilara glanced at Kaelin, his strong profile silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky. Their alliance had been forged in a moment of public defiance. Their partnership had been built in the quiet confines of the war room. But here, in the wild, dangerous heart of their enemy's territory, something else was being forged. Something fragile and tentative, yet more powerful than any treaty. It felt, terrifyingly, like the beginning of love. The aftermath of the Shadowfall raid was precisely the strategic chaos Ilara had predicted. News of the spoiled grain reserves sent a shockwave through Valeruz's kingdom. Panic set in. Food prices skyrocketed. Small, scattered riots broke out in the human territories as the populace realized their winter sustenance was gone. The vampire king, for all his power, could not conjure food from thin air. Just as she'd hoped, he was forced to pull his legions back from the borders to quell the unrest in his own heartland. The pressure on Ilara's homeland eased almost overnight. In the north, the diversionary attack by Ulrich's forces had been a success, drawing the bulk of the Obsidian Empress's army into a fruitless chase through the mountains, leaving the Lycan strongholds secure. Their gamble had paid off. Back in Skolheim, the atmosphere was transformed. The suspicious glances that had followed Ilara were replaced with nods of respect, even smiles. She was no longer the foreign princess, she was the architect of their greatest victory, the queen who had ridden with their lord into the heart of enemy territory. The pack, which had been wary of her, now began to embrace her. Children would bring her interesting stones they had found. Warriors would seek her opinion on matters beyond the war council. And Gael, the old elder, now saved her the choicest cut of meat at every meal, a small but significant gesture of acceptance. Ilara felt herself changing, settling into this new life, this new version of herself. The silks and jewels of her past felt like a costume for a role she no longer played. The leathers and furs of the north felt like her own skin. But the greatest change was between her and Kaelin. The shared danger and triumph of the raid had irrevocably altered the space between them. The formal courtesy was gone, replaced by an easy camaraderie. They sought each other's company, falling into conversation not just about the war, but about their lives, their pasts, their hopes. He told her stories of his youth, of learning to command his first hunt, of the burden of becoming lord after his father's death. She, in turn, told him of her lonely childhood in a court that valued her only for her bloodline, of her love for books and maps, of the quiet dreams she'd had of a life beyond political marriage. They were discovering each other, piece by piece, and with each discovery, the attraction that had simmered beneath the surface grew stronger, more undeniable. It was in the way his eyes would find hers across the crowded great hall, the way he would instinctively move to stand beside her, the way a casual brush of their hands would send a jolt through them both. The stone wall between their chambers began to feel less like a protection and more like a prison. The nights were the hardest. Ilara would lie awake, listening to the sound of the wind howling outside her window, achingly aware of him just on the other side of the wall. She wondered if he was awake, too. She wondered if he felt the same pull, the same magnetic, terrifying force that was drawing them together. Their marriage was one of politics. He had promised her space, autonomy. He had never once broken that promise. And now, she found herself wishing he would. One evening, he sought her out in the library. She was curled in a worn armchair by the fire, reading an old book of Lycan legends. He didn't speak at first, just stood by the hearth, watching the flames, the firelight casting flickering shadows across his strong features. "Ilara," he said finally, his voice soft, hesitant. She looked up, her heart giving a familiar lurch at the sight of him. "Kaelin." He turned to her, and the look in his eyes was raw, vulnerable, stripped of all his usual command. "This, what is between us, it is no longer just an alliance." Her breath caught. "No," she whispered. "It is not." He took a step towards her, then another, until he was standing before her chair. He knelt down, bringing his eyes level with hers. The gesture was one of deference, of supplication, a king kneeling before his queen, and it undid her completely. "When I accepted your proposal in that cathedral," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur, "I did it for my people. It was a strategic decision." A means to an end. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before his fingers gently cupped her jaw. His touch was electric, a brand of warmth and tenderness on her skin. "I did not expect you. I did not expect your courage, or your intelligence, or your compassion. I did not expect to come to," he faltered, searching for the word, "to care for you so deeply." Tears pricked at Ilara's eyes. "And I," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "married you out of rage and spite. I used you as a weapon against a man who hurt me." She raised a hand to cover his, pressing his palm against her cheek. "I did not expect to find a home here. I did not expect to find a man of honor, a true king. I did not expect to." She couldn't say the word. It was too new, too fragile, too immense. He understood. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. They stayed like that for a long moment, breathing the same air, their hearts beating in the same frantic rhythm. The world outside, the war, the politics, The kingdoms fell away. There was only the firelight, the scent of old books and wood smoke, and the overwhelming, terrifying, beautiful truth of what they had become to each other. Elara, he breathed her name like a prayer. I will not break the promise I made you. Your rooms, your life, they are your own. I will never demand more than you are willing to give. His thumb stroked her cheek, a featherlight touch that sent shivers down her spine. But I have to ask. I have to know. Is this all we are to be? Allies? Friends? The question hung in the air between them, shimmering with hope and fear. This was the precipice, the final, most important choice she had to make. She could hold to the safety of their arrangement, or she could leap, trusting that he would catch her. She looked into his twilight eyes, and she saw her future. Not a future of crowns and thrones, but of shared laughter and quiet strength, of partnership and passion. A future she had never dared to dream of. No, she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. It is not all I wish for us to be. A shudder went through him, a wave of relief so profound it was almost a sound. A slow, wondrous smile spread across his face, the first genuine, unguarded smile she had ever seen from him. It transformed him, chasing away the last of the shadows, revealing the joyful, loving man beneath the stoic king. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, not yet. It was a kiss of discovery, of reverence. It was gentle, questioning, a seal on the unspoken promises that had grown between them. It tasted of wood smoke and winter air and a profound, bone-deep rightness. In his kiss, she felt not the possessiveness of a king claiming his queen, but the deep, soul-shaking relief of a lonely man finally coming home. And as she kissed him back, pouring all of her own loneliness, her own hope, her own burgeoning love into that single, perfect touch, Elara knew that she was home, too. The marriage born of spite had, against all odds, become a marriage of the heart. Their newfound intimacy changed everything and nothing. In public, they were still the Lord and Lady of Skolheim, a united front, their alliance a beacon of strength. But in the quiet moments, in the stolen glances across the war table, in the lingering touches as they passed in a corridor, there was a new, vibrant current of energy. The stone wall between their chambers was no longer a barrier, it was a door waiting to be opened. And one night, she opened it. She had been in her chambers, unable to read, unable to rest, her entire being humming with an awareness of him, so close, just on the other side. The need to be with him was a physical ache. After a long, internal battle with the last vestiges of her fear, she rose, crossed the room, and turned the heavy iron handle. He was standing at his window, looking out at the moonlit mountains, as if he had been waiting. He turned as she entered, and the look on his face, a mixture of surprise, hope, and a deep, raw hunger made her heart stop. Elara, he breathed. She walked towards him, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floor. She stopped before him, and without a word, reached up and placed her hands on his chest. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart beneath her palms. I am tired of sleeping alone, she said, her voice a soft murmur in the quiet room. A look of such profound tenderness crossed his face that it stole her breath. He gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in his world. I have been waiting for you since the moment I first saw you, he confessed, his voice thick with emotion as he buried his face in her hair. Standing at that altar, so proud and so broken. I think my soul recognized you even then. That night, they became husband and wife in truth. It was a joining not of kingdoms, but of souls. A slow, tender, passionate discovery of each other, a mapping of skin and spirit. With him, Elara felt cherished, desired, and, for the first time in her life, completely and utterly safe. He was both a fierce, powerful protector and a gentle, attentive lover, and in his arms, she finally understood what it meant to belong. Their love became the quiet, beating heart of Skolheim. It radiated outwards, strengthening the morale of the pack, solidifying their alliance into something unbreakable. They were no longer just a strategic partnership, they were a family. But the world outside their mountain fortress had not forgotten them. Valerus, having finally stabilized his kingdom after the grain crisis, was plotting his revenge. His pride had been wounded, his authority challenged. He could not let the insult stand. A delegation arrived from a neutral human territory, calling for a peace summit. They proposed a meeting on neutral ground, a chance to negotiate a truce before the conflict escalated into a full-scale, continent-spanning war. It was a transparent trap. Ilara knew Valerus's methods. He would use the summit to try and drive a wedge between her and Kaelin, to assassinate them, or to capture her and undo the alliance that had caused him so much trouble. "We will not go," Kaelin said immediately, his protective instincts flaring. "It is too dangerous. And if we do not go," Ilara countered, her voice calm and steady, "we will appear weak. We will seem like the aggressors, afraid to even speak of peace. It will damage our standing with the other human kingdoms whose support we need." She placed a hand on his arm, her touch a soothing balm on his anger. "He expects us to be afraid. He expects us to hide. So we will do the opposite. We will go. We will face him. Together." She saw the conflict in his eyes, the warrior king warring with the man who loved her. But he trusted her. He trusted their strength. "Together," he agreed, his voice a low growl of assent. The summit was held in a desolate, wind-swept castle on the coast, a place of crumbling towers and the cry of gulls. The air was thick with tension. Valerus was there, resplendent in black and silver, his face a mask of cold, regal fury. Beside him stood the Obsidian Empress, a woman as beautiful and as deadly as a polished shard of volcanic glass. Ilara entered the negotiation chamber on Kaelin's arm. She wore not the silks of a southern princess, but the leathers and furs of a lichen queen. She met Valerus's gaze without flinching, her expression cool and composed. The man who had shattered her world at the altar now seemed smaller. His power was a hollow, brittle thing compared to the solid, unyielding strength of the man beside her. "Ilara," Valerus said, his voice smooth as poisoned honey. "You look rustic. I trust your new accommodations are not too crude for your tastes." "I have found," Ilara replied, her voice ringing with a clarity that silenced the room, "that the honesty of a wolf's den is preferable to the gilded cage of a viper's nest. I have never been more content." His eyes narrowed, a flicker of true anger breaking through his composure. The summit devolved quickly. Valerus's peace terms were nothing more than a demand for unconditional surrender. He demanded Ilara be returned to him. To face judgment for her betrayal, he demanded the lichens cede their ancestral lands. Kaelin listened to the litany of impossible demands, his face a mask of stone. When Valerus had finished, Kaelin simply shook his head. "No. You would plunge this continent into war," the Empress hissed, "for a runaway human bride." Kaelin turned his twilight gaze on her, his power a palpable force in the room. "I would burn this continent to the ground to protect my queen," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the deadly promise of absolute conviction. He placed his hand over Ilara's, a simple, possessive gesture that was a declaration in itself. It was then that Ilara knew what she had to do. This was not a conflict that could be won with armies or treaties alone. It was a story, and Valerus had, until now, controlled the narrative. It was time to write a new ending. She stepped forward. "You speak of my betrayal, Valerus," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Let us speak of yours. You offered my people your protection in exchange for my hand. A sacred vow. And you broke it. You broke it publicly, for political gain, without a thought for my honor or the lives you had sworn to protect. You left me standing alone at an altar, a symbol of your faithlessness." She let her gaze sweep over the neutral delegates. "I did not run. I did not betray anyone. I forged a new alliance. An alliance with a man who understands the meaning of his word. A man who protects his people. A man who honors his queen." She looked back at Valerus, and for the first time, she did not see the powerful king who had broken her heart. She saw only a petty, arrogant man, terrified of losing his power. "You did not discard me, Valerus," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet every person in the room heard it. "You freed me. And my only regret is that I did not find my way to the north sooner." The silence that followed was deafening. She had not screamed or wept. She had simply spoken the truth, and in doing so, she had stripped him of his power, his narrative, his justification. She had reframed the story not as one of her betrayal, but of his failure. Valerus stared at her, his face pale with a rage so profound it was almost beautiful. He had lost. Not the war, not yet. But he had lost this battle. He had lost the moral high ground. He had been diminished, not by a sword, but by a woman he had once considered nothing more than a pawn. He rose, his chair scraping harshly against the stone floor. This summit is over, he turned and swept from the room, his empress trailing in his wake like a shadow. Ilara stood her ground, Kaelin's hand a warm, solid anchor in hers. The neutral delegates looked at her with a newfound respect. She had faced the monster and had not blinked. As they left the castle, walking out into the clean, salt-scented air, Kaelin pulled her to a stop. He framed her face with his hands, his eyes blazing with a love and pride so fierce it made her weak in the knees. "My queen," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have the heart of the greatest wolf I have ever known." He kissed her then, a deep, passionate kiss filled with love and triumph, a promise of the future they would build together. The war was not over, she knew. There would be more battles, more struggles. But as she stood there, wrapped in the arms of her husband, her king, her love, she knew with absolute certainty that they would face it all together. Their love, born from the ashes of betrayal and spite, had become a fire that would light their way through any darkness, a fortress more unbreachable than any stone wall. They were the king and queen of the north, and their reign was just beginning.